The envelope had my name on it. That's the first thing I need you to understand. Not a name that sounded like mine, not initials that could have belonged to anyone. My full name, in neat black type, sitting right there on top of the communion table, like it had always belonged. And when First Lady Renee Caldwell looked down and saw it, she did something I had never seen that woman do in 17 years of church membership. She stopped, mid-sentence, mid-smile, mid-everything. The color didn't drain from her face because she's a brown-skinned woman, and God made her too beautifully for that. But her eyes went somewhere else entirely. Somewhere private and cold and afraid. And I need you to stay with me, because what was inside that envelope changed everything I thought I knew about the place I called my second home. Everything. My name is Carolyn Elaine Watkins Burgess. I am 54 years old, I work as a patient advocate at a regional hospital, and I have been a member of Greater Restoration Missionary Baptist Church in a mid-sized city in the southeast for going on 17 years. I am not the kind of woman who causes scenes. I am not a gossip, I do not run in church cliques, and I do not carry tales. My late mother, Estelle Mae Watkins, raised me to walk into any room with my back straight, my mouth controlled, and my discernment sharp. And she did it by example, right up until the Lord called her home 8 years ago. I have one adult daughter named Deja who lives in Atlanta and calls me every Sunday after service. I was married for 19 years to a good man named Harold Burgess who passed from a heart attack 4 years ago. And the grief of that loss is what drove me deeper into the church, deeper into service, deeper into a faith I needed to hold on to with both hands. I tell you all of that so you understand who I was walking into this story as. Not a troublemaker, not an enemy. A woman who loved her church, served her church, and trusted the people who led it. I am, or I was, until that Sunday, the chair of the hospitality ministry and a senior usher at Greater Restoration. I've helped coordinate 3 building fund campaigns, organized the annual Women's Day luncheon for 9 consecutive years, and personally mentored a rotating group of young women in our congregation through what we call the Daughters of Purpose Circle. The church knew my name the way they knew the color of the carpet in the sanctuary. I was simply there. Faithful, reliable, present. That morning was our church's 42nd anniversary celebration. First Sunday in October, and Greater Restoration had pulled out every stop. The sanctuary smelled like chrysanthemums and good perfume. The ushers, my team, were dressed in white and gold, which I had personally coordinated weeks in advance, pressing my own uniform 3 times because the first 2 starches weren't right. The mothers of the church sat in their reserved pews in the front left section, crown hats tilted just so, hand fans already moving even though the air conditioning was perfectly fine. It was a habit. It was ritual. It was beautiful. The mass choir was in full regalia, and when they opened the service with, "We've come this far by faith," you felt it in your chest like a second heartbeat. The plan for the morning was a special communion service, followed by a 42nd anniversary offering, a video tribute, and remarks from Pastor Elijah Caldwell. Everything had been organized, bulletins printed, anniversary programs tied with gold ribbon, and stacked at every entrance. I had been at the church by 6:30 that morning, helping Sister Loretta from the kitchen ministry set up the communion elements. The little trays of juice, the wafer plates wrapped in linen, everything arranged on the communion table at the front of the sanctuary with the kind of care you give to sacred things. And that is where the envelope was. I didn't notice it immediately. I was double-checking the placement of the programs, making sure the ushers had their assignments, doing the dozen small things that keep a service running smoothly. It was Sister Loretta who said, "Carolyn, honey, what is that?" and pointed toward the communion table. I looked up. There it was, a standard white envelope, letter-sized, no church letterhead, no seal, just my name, printed clean and plain, Carolyn E. Watkins Burgess. Nothing else on the front. And it was sitting right there among the linen-covered communion elements like someone had placed it with purpose. I picked it up. It was sealed. I turned it over. Nothing on the back. Here is what I want you to ask yourself, because I'm asking myself even now as I tell it. Who puts a personal envelope on a communion table? Not in the offering plates, not at the welcome table, not slipped under the door of my office in the ministry suite. On the communion table. The most sacred piece of furniture in that sanctuary, where the body and blood of Christ are represented. Whoever put that envelope there knew what they were doing. They wanted it found in a specific place, at a specific time, in a specific way. I tucked it into my portfolio. I carry a leather portfolio to every service for notes and announcements. And I kept moving. There was too much to do before 9 o'clock to stop and open personal mail. The moment everything shifted was about 40 minutes into the pre-service setup. First Lady Renee Caldwell came through the sanctuary at her usual time, about 7:15, doing her walk-through the way she always did. Renee Caldwell was a woman designed to fill a room. She was 59 years old. She wore suits that were always pressed into submission. She had natural silver at her temples that she wore like jewelry, and she carried herself with the particular confidence of a woman who has been in authority long enough that she doesn't need to announce it. I respected her. I genuinely did. We were not close friends. First Lady Caldwell kept a certain distance from the general congregation, which some people found cold and others found appropriate for her position. But we were cordial. She had thanked me personally every year for the Women's Day luncheon. She called me Sister Carolyn in that warm, measured way she had. That morning, I had taken the envelope out of my portfolio briefly. I don't even remember exactly why. Maybe I was reorganizing. And it was sitting on the edge of the communion table again when First Lady Caldwell walked up. She was saying something to one of the junior ushers, something about the floral arrangement being too tall for the sightlines, and then her eyes moved to the table, and they landed on that envelope, and she stopped talking. Mid-sentence. The junior usher, a sweet girl named Brianna, just stood there waiting for her to finish. But First Lady Caldwell did not finish. Her eyes locked on my name on that envelope, and for what felt like a very long moment but was probably only 5 seconds, she was somewhere else entirely. Her hand, and this detail I will never forget, her hand came up slowly and pressed flat against the front of her suit jacket, right over her sternum, like something had knocked the air out of her from the inside. Then she recovered, smoothly, professionally, the way a woman of her experience recovers from things. She looked up, looked past the envelope, told Brianna the flowers would be fine, and walked toward the pastor's study without looking at me once. Now, I want you to understand what that did to me, because a reaction like that complete, that involuntary, is not nothing. That is a woman who saw something she recognized, something she feared, and the thing she feared had my name on it. I picked the envelope back up, I put it in my portfolio, and I decided it could wait until after service, because that is who I am. I was not going to let my personal business interrupt the 42nd anniversary of my church. My mama raised me better than that. But my hands were not completely steady when I handed out the first programs. Let me slow down for a moment, because what happened next only makes sense if you understand the structure of Greater Restoration and where I fit inside it. The church had about 400 active members. Pastor Caldwell had been leading the congregation for 22 years. He took the pulpit young, at 32, and he built that ministry with genuine spiritual fire and no small amount of personal charisma. He was a good preacher in the truest sense. Not a performer, not a showman, but a man who consistently stood before his congregation and delivered the word with a sincerity you couldn't manufacture. I believed in his ministry. Most of Greater Restoration did. First Lady Caldwell functioned, as many First Ladies do in congregations of that size, as the co-architect of the ministry's social and administrative structures. She chaired the Women's Auxiliary, she oversaw the Church Benevolence Fund, and she was the de facto manager of what I would call the church's image. She made decisions about programming, about which ministries received promotion, about who got elevated in service roles, and who quietly stayed where they were. She was not the pastor, but she operated with the pastor's full authority in every practical situation. That is not unusual in our church culture. That is simply how many congregations function, and most of the time, it worked fine. The Benevolence Fund was the part of the ministry that mattered most to me in this story, and I'll tell you why in a moment. Greater Restoration's Benevolence Fund served congregation members and community families who needed help, utility bills, prescription costs, burial expenses, emergency rent assistance. It was funded by a designated portion of the annual building fund and by a specific monthly offering the first Sunday of each month. First Lady Caldwell oversaw it. She had for about 6 years. Before that, it had been administered through the Deacon Board under a rotating 3-person committee. The transition to her oversight had happened quietly, with a motion at a business meeting that most people, myself included, hadn't thought much about at the time. The service that morning was everything it was supposed to be. The choir sang 3 numbers that had the whole congregation on its feet, including a rendition of "I Know It Was the Blood" that I still hear in my sleep when I close my eyes on hard nights. Pastor Caldwell preached from Psalm 66. "Come and see the works of God. He is terrible in his doing toward the children of men." And he was electric. The kind of sermon that reminds you why you keep coming back. The anniversary offering was strong. The video tribute made 3 of the older mothers cry. And I sat through all of it with that envelope in my portfolio, feeling it the way you feel a splinter you can't quite reach. After the final hymn, after the benediction, I went to the women's restroom in the education wing, not the main restroom off the foyer, which would be crowded, but the quieter one at the back of the building that most people forgot about. I sat down on the bench in the small lounge area, and I opened the envelope. There were 3 things inside. The first was a printed spreadsheet, 2 pages, formatted like a financial ledger, with dates, dollar amounts, and what appeared to be fund designations running down the left column. The header at the top read, "GR Benevolence Fund, Disbursement Log, January-August." The dollar amounts were significant. Some of the disbursements had names beside them, members of the congregation I recognized. But there were also entries, quite a few of them, totaling somewhere in the range of $22,000 based on my quick, shaking mental math, where the name column read simply C. Watkins Burgess. My name. Disbursements supposedly paid to me, that I had never received. The second item was a handwritten note on plain white paper. The handwriting was careful, deliberate, the kind of printing someone uses when they want to be legible and untraceable at the same time. It said, "Sister Carolyn, they are going to say you took it. This is the version they are showing the auditors. The real version is different. I can't keep this anymore. God forgive me. A friend." The third item was a single photograph, printed on regular copy paper. It showed a screen, looked like someone had photographed a computer monitor, with a zoomed view of what appeared to be a bank transaction record. The account number was partially obscured, but the name on the account was not. The name read, C. Watkins Burgess. I sat with those 3 pieces of paper in my hands for a long time. Long enough that Sister Paulette from the kitchen ministry knocked on the restroom door to ask if I was all right, because she'd seen me come in and she was about to send somebody looking. I told her I was fine, just needed a minute. And I sat there a little longer. Here is what I understood in that moment. Someone had been using my name, my identity, perhaps my actual information, to disguise the movement of money from the Greater Restoration Benevolence Fund. $22,000 had supposedly been disbursed to me. I had never seen a dime of it. And somewhere in the administrative machinery of my church, there was a version of a financial record being prepared for an audit, that showed me as the recipient of funds that had actually gone somewhere else, or someone else. And First Lady Renee Caldwell, who had administered that benevolence fund for 6 years, had seen my name on that envelope and gone silent as stone. I am a patient advocate. I work with insurance companies, hospital billing departments, and sometimes legal teams every single week. I know what a paper trail looks like. I know what it means when someone constructs a paper trail that points at you. And I know that the time to act is not when you are emotional. The time to act is when you are clear. I folded those papers carefully, put them back in the envelope, put the envelope at the bottom of my purse under my Bible. I washed my hands. I checked my face in the mirror. I walked back out into the fellowship hall, accepted a plate of anniversary cake from Brother Titus in the kitchen, and said my proper goodbyes to the people I always say goodbye to after service. And I did not let my face show anything. Because whoever had constructed this situation had underestimated me, and I intended to keep it that way for as long as possible. The next morning, Monday, I used a personal day from work. I needed to think, and I needed to move, and I could not do either sitting at a hospital desk with 40 calls in my queue. My first call, at 8:15 in the morning, was to Mother Ida Jean Stokes, 81 years old, founder's granddaughter. Had been a member of Greater Restoration since before Pastor Caldwell was born. Had served as a nurse for 30 years, which meant her mind was organized and her eyes missed almost nothing. Mother Stokes was, by every reasonable measure, the institutional memory of that church. She also happened to be one of the original 3-person committee that had administered the Benevolence Fund before First Lady Caldwell took it over. I did not tell her everything on the phone. I told her I needed to sit with her, that it was important, and that it was private. She told me to come by at 10. When I got to her house, a small, immaculate brick home with a rosebush by the front door that she had tended for 40 years, she met me at the door already knowing from my voice that this was serious. I sat at her kitchen table. She made me coffee I didn't want, but accepted because refusing Mother Stokes's hospitality was not a conversation I had time for. And I told her. I laid the contents of that envelope out on her kitchen table and I walked her through it. She did not say anything for a long time. She looked at each page carefully, the way she must have looked at patient charts all those years ago, methodical, unhurried, thorough. When she had looked at everything, she folded her hands on the table, looked at me over her glasses, and said, "How long have you been in this church, Carolyn?" I said, 17 years. She said, "Mm-hmm. And in 17 years, has anyone ever had reason to question your integrity?" I said, "No." She said, "Then this is not about you. It never was." And then she told me something that opened a door I hadn't even known to knock on. She told me that about 8 months earlier, the previous February, she had been asked to sign a letter on behalf of the Women's Auxiliary authorizing a ministry partnership disbursement of funds from the benevolence account to support a grief counseling program for church widows. She had signed it because grief counseling for widows was a cause she believed in. But when she had followed up 3 months later to ask about the program, who was running it, how many women had been served, she had been told by First Lady Caldwell's assistant that the program was still in development. And when she'd pressed, the conversation had been redirected and never completed. Mother Stokes looked at me and said, "I should have pushed harder. I know better." I told her she hadn't known what she was dealing with. None of us had. She asked me what I was going to do. I told her I was going to be very careful and very quiet and very sure before I moved in any direction. And I asked her if she would be willing to sit with me through whatever came next. She reached across the kitchen table and covered my hand with hers. Her hands were small and dry and absolutely steady, and she said, "Baby, I have been waiting on the Lord to expose this situation for 8 months. I will sit with you as long as it takes." That was Monday. By Friday of that same week, things had already started moving in ways that told me someone was nervous. On Wednesday, I received a call from Deacon Marcus Webb. Deacon Webb was a 47-year-old man who worked in commercial real estate and served on the church's Finance Oversight Board, or what was supposed to be the Finance Oversight Board, a body that I would come to understand had been largely ceremonial for several years. He was calling, he said, just to check in, to see how I was doing. He'd heard I'd seemed a little distracted after the anniversary service, and he just wanted me to know the church family loved me. It was a perfectly constructed pastoral call except for the fact that Deacon Webb had never called me once in 17 years to check on my well-being. I thanked him warmly. I told him I was fine. I told him the anniversary service had been moving, and I was just still in my feelings about it, which was true enough not to feel like a lie. On Thursday, First Lady Caldwell herself called me. This was more notable. She called my cell phone, not the church directory line. She said she'd been meaning to reach out and discuss the Women's Day planning for the coming year. And could we find a time to sit down together, perhaps next week? I said, of course, that would be lovely. And I pulled out my calendar and gave her 3 possible times. She chose the following Tuesday at 11. She sounded completely normal, professional, warm, measured. She did not sound like a woman who had stood at a communion table 48 hours earlier, looking at my name on an envelope with the color of fear in her eyes. That was the detail that settled something in me. Not the call itself, but how normal she sounded. Because that level of composure in the face of what I now knew she knew, that took practice. That took someone who had managed uncomfortable situations before. And that told me this was not a spontaneous mistake. This was a system. On Friday, something happened that I had not anticipated. I stopped by the church to pick up the hospitality ministry supply inventory sheet from the storage room in the education wing. A completely ordinary errand I had done dozens of times. I had my key to the ministry suite, the way I always did. But when I put my key in the lock of the hospitality ministry office, it didn't turn. I stood there for a moment, trying it again. Nothing. The lock had been changed. I went to the church office to ask about it. The administrative assistant, a young woman named Tamara, who had been in her position for about a year, told me that the First Lady had asked for several ministry office locks to be rekeyed as part of what she described as a security update. Tamara said it carefully, like someone reading from a script she'd been given and wasn't entirely comfortable with. She handed me a form to fill out to request a new key. I took the form. I thanked her. And I walked out of that church office with my chest absolutely tight because there had been no announcement about any security update. And the order had come from First Lady Caldwell, not from the pastor's office. The timing of it, 4 days after that envelope appeared, was not a coincidence I was willing to call a coincidence. I sat in my car in the parking lot for about 10 minutes. And then I called my daughter Deja in Atlanta. Deja is 31. She has her father's directness and my mother's wisdom, and she works as a compliance officer for a healthcare organization, which means she thinks about exactly the kind of documentation and liability issues I was now sitting in the middle of. I told her everything, all of it. I heard her go very quiet on the phone in the way she goes quiet when she is assembling information. She said, "Mama, have you talked to anyone at the bank?" I said I didn't know which bank. She said, "The account on that transaction record, even with the number obscured, a bank can tell you whether an account exists in your name that you didn't open. You can call and request a full account search. That is within your rights as a consumer." I had not thought of that. I told her she was her father's child. She said, "Call them today. And Mama, don't meet with First Lady Caldwell Tuesday unless someone else is in the room with you." I called my bank that afternoon. And I called a second financial institution, one I'd seen mentioned on a document Deja had helped me pull from the state's nonprofit registry, which showed Greater Restoration's listed banking relationships. It took several phone calls and about 3 days, but by the following Monday, I had confirmation from one of those institutions that an account had been opened 18 months prior in a name that matched mine, with a variation in the middle name, using what appeared to be a version of my personal information. Now, I want to pause here and answer the question that was forming in my own mind, and likely in yours. How would anyone have access to my personal information in the first place? The answer, when I traced it back, was both simple and infuriating. Like most active ministry leaders at Greater Restoration, I had filled out multiple administrative forms over the years: volunteer registration forms, ministry insurance documentation, emergency contact records, even a form for a small church-administered life insurance benefit that the Women's Auxiliary maintained for senior members. All of those forms were kept in the church's ministry files, which were managed through the administrative office, an office that fell under First Lady Caldwell's direct oversight. My social security number, date of birth, and address were all sitting in a folder in a cabinet inside that building, in forms I had signed in good faith, trusting they would be used only for the purposes I had provided them. That trust had been weaponized. And knowing that made what had already been painful feel like something far more calculated and cold. I had not opened that account. I had never seen that account. The institution's fraud department was opening an inquiry. Let me tell you, I did not sleep well those nights. Not because I was afraid of what would happen to me. I want to be clear about that. But because I was grieving. Every night I lay in that bed that Harold used to share with me, in a house that my faith had helped hold together after I lost him, and I processed the reality that a place I had given 17 years of my life to had been used as a vehicle for someone to construct a crime and hang it on my name. That grief is specific and it is real, and I don't want to minimize it by moving past it too quickly. The betrayal of a faith community cuts differently than other betrayals. It goes into a part of you that was trying to be open and holy and good, and the wound it makes there doesn't heal the same way other wounds do. But grief and action are not mutually exclusive. My mother taught me that too. The Tuesday meeting with First Lady Caldwell, I kept it, but I made a phone call first. I called Deacon Leonard Frazier, who was the longest-serving deacon at Greater Restoration, and who I knew to be a man of unusual personal integrity. He was 68 years old, a retired school principal, and he was one of those rare people in church life who had managed to remain trusted by virtually everyone without being owned by anyone. I had watched him for 17 years navigate the complicated politics of that church with his dignity intact, and I knew from small moments over the years, a comment here, a vote there, that he was not comfortable with how certain administrative matters had been handled in recent years. He'd never said anything directly to me, but I had eyes. I called him Sunday evening, and I told him I needed him present at my Tuesday meeting, not as an advocate, but as a witness. I told him I had information about a serious matter, and I wanted a trustworthy person in the room who was not emotionally entangled in the outcome. I did not tell him everything yet. I just asked, and he agreed. Tuesday morning, 11 o'clock. I arrived at the church 7 minutes early, which is my standard. I was dressed simply. A navy dress, pearl earrings my mother left me, low heels. Deacon Frazier was already in the hallway outside the First Lady's office when I arrived. He gave me a nod. Nothing more was needed. First Lady Caldwell opened the door at exactly 11. She saw Deacon Frazier. Her eyes moved between us. Something shifted in her face. Not fear exactly, more like recalculation. She recovered in approximately 1 second and extended her hand to him warmly, said she hadn't realized this was going to be a group meeting, and invited us both in. Her office was beautifully appointed. She had a gift for spaces, I'll give her that. Framed scriptures, a fresh arrangement of white flowers, a credenza with framed photos of ministry events and mission trips. We sat across from her desk. She opened by talking about Women's Day. I let her talk. I had my portfolio on my lap, and inside my portfolio was a sealed envelope of my own. Not the original envelope, but a folder with photocopies of everything, because the originals were now with a financial crimes attorney I had consulted on Monday afternoon, a woman named Patricia Holland, who was a member of another church in our city, and who had been recommended to me by Deja's compliance officer network. First Lady Caldwell talked about Women's Day for about 4 minutes. Then she paused and asked if I had anything I wanted to bring to the agenda. I said yes. I opened my portfolio. I set the copies on the desk between us, and I said, quietly and evenly, I'd like to ask about the disbursement records from the Benevolence Fund that list my name as a recipient for funds I never received. The silence was not like the silence from the communion table. That silence had been involuntary, a physical response she couldn't control. This silence was different. This was the silence of a very composed woman deciding how to proceed. Deacon Frazier shifted slightly in his chair but said nothing. He was watching. First Lady Caldwell looked at the papers. She looked at me. She said, I think there may have been a clerical error. I said, possibly. But a clerical error wouldn't explain the bank account that was opened in a variation of my name 18 months ago without my knowledge. The fraud department at that institution has already opened an inquiry. Deacon Frazier was very still. First Lady Caldwell's voice went careful. She said she wasn't sure what I was suggesting, but that any financial irregularities should go through the proper church processes, and that this kind of conversation was better suited to the finance board, not an impromptu meeting. I said, I agree completely, That's exactly what I'm asking for. A meeting with the finance board, with the full disbursement records, with Pastor Caldwell present. I'd like to call that meeting within the next 10 days. I looked at her steadily. I said, if there's a clerical error, that meeting will resolve it quickly. If there's something more, then that meeting is necessary, regardless of how uncomfortable it might be. She held my gaze for a long moment, and then she said she would consult with the pastor and get back to me. I said, of course. I'll follow up in writing by end of week if I haven't heard. We stood. Deacon Fraser shook her hand, said a brief, polite goodbye, and we walked out together. In the parking lot, he turned to me and said, in the understatement that was so characteristic of him, Carolyn, I think we need to talk. We sat in his car for 45 minutes. I told him everything. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, I've been uncomfortable with the Benevolence Fund administration for 3 years. I raised it once in a board meeting and it was managed. He said it with the slight heaviness of a man who knows he should have pushed harder. I told him the same thing I told Mother Stokes. None of us had known. He said, I'm going to call 2 other deacons tonight. Men I trust. We're going to call that meeting ourselves if we have to. Here is where I need to tell you about Brother Jonah, because he was the detail I hadn't expected. Jonah Simmons was 26 years old. He'd grown up in the church, he played keyboard in the praise band, and for the past year and a half, he'd been doing part-time administrative work for the church office. Data entry, filing, updating the membership database. He was quiet, kept to himself, had the slightly distracted look of a young man who is always partly somewhere else. I had barely noticed him beyond a friendly wave on Sunday mornings. On the Wednesday after my meeting with First Lady Caldwell, Jonah found me in the parking lot. He looked like he hadn't slept. He said, Sister Carolyn, I have to tell you something. He said it low and fast. I'm the one who put that envelope on the communion table. I looked at him. He explained that on anniversary Sundays, the praise band always arrived at 5:30 in the morning for a full sound check and extended rehearsal. The kind of service required 2 extra hours of preparation. He had slipped into the sanctuary alone before anyone else arrived from the kitchen ministry, placed the envelope on the communion table in the near dark, and left to join the rest of the band in the fellowship hall. By the time Sister Loretta and I came in at 6:30, the envelope had been there for almost an hour. The envelope itself had been given to him by a church member who had since moved out of state, an older gentleman named Brother Calvin, who had worked as a bookkeeper in a previous professional life and who had done some informal bookkeeping assistance for the church office about 2 years earlier. Brother Calvin had apparently discovered the discrepancies during his volunteer work and documented what he found. He'd been afraid to come forward directly. Before he moved away, he had given the documents to Jonah with instructions to get them to someone trustworthy who would know what to do. Jonah had held on to them for almost 6 months, terrified. The anniversary Sunday had been his moment of conscience. He'd placed the envelope where he knew I would find it, in a location where the sacred context would give it weight, and where it couldn't simply disappear into a desk drawer. I asked him if he knew what was in the envelope. He said Brother Calvin had told him. Someone was using church funds and a false account under a member's name to redirect benevolence money. He hadn't known whose name until he saw the envelope. I told Jonah he had done the right thing, even if it took a while. I told him I was going to need him to be willing to speak to the deacons, and potentially to a legal process. He swallowed hard. He said, "Yes, ma'am, whatever you need." He also told me, and this was the second major turn I had not seen coming, that First Lady Caldwell's personal assistant had come to him the previous day and asked, very casually, whether he knew anything about an envelope that had been misplaced at the anniversary service. He said he'd told her no, but his hands were shaking when he told me about it. Whatever clerical error story was being constructed on the other side of this, it was already fraying. Let me slow down here, because what happened in the next 2 weeks only makes sense if you understand who was carrying what. I had the original documents with my attorney. Jonah had first-hand knowledge of how the envelope got there. Mother Stokes had the 8-month-old unsigned authorization that had never produced a program. Deacon Fraser had 3 years of institutional memory about irregularities that had been quietly buried. and the financial fraud inquiry at the bank was moving on its own timeline, independent of anything happening inside that church building. All of those threads were pulling in the same direction, and the people who wanted them to stop pulling were running out of ways to grab them all at once. The finance board meeting happened 12 days after I requested it. It took Deacon Fraser and 2 other deacons formally invoking their board authority to make it happen, because the initial response from the church office had been to delay, first suggesting a date 3 weeks out, then citing scheduling conflicts, then, on the 4th day, going quiet entirely until Deacon Fraser sent a formal written request to Pastor Caldwell directly. Pastor Caldwell. I want to talk about him for a moment because this story is not complete without him, and because he was a more complicated figure in it than either a villain or a hero. When Deacon Fraser finally got him on the phone, not through the church office but on his personal cell, the pastor went very quiet, in the way that people go quiet when they are receiving information they have been half expecting and half dreading. Deacon Fraser told me later that Pastor Caldwell's response was not defensive. He said, "How long?" And then, "I see." And then he called the meeting himself. I believe that Pastor Caldwell did not know the full scope of what had been happening. I believe he had accepted, over the years, the kind of comfortable administrative distance from the benevolence fund that a busy pastor allows himself when his wife is competent and his church is growing, and asking hard questions might disturb a peace he'd worked hard to build. I believe the distance had become a habit, and the habit had become a vulnerability, and the vulnerability had been used. I say this not to excuse him. I say it because I think it is true, and because one of the things I've learned about sin in institutions is that it rarely requires active villains at every level. Often it only requires enough people who are looking slightly the other way. He walked into that finance board meeting looking like a man who had done very little sleeping. He sat at the head of the table. There were 6 deacons present. Deacon Fraser sat to the pastor's left. Deacon Webb sat near the far end of the table, and I noticed he was quiet in a way that was different from his usual manner. Not the quiet of a man waiting to speak, but the quiet of a man calculating costs. There was an external accountant who the deacons had quietly retained. Mother Stokes was present because Deacon Fraser had invited her as an institutional witness, and whatever anyone might have wanted to say about that, no one in that room was going to ask Ida Jean Stokes to leave. First Lady Caldwell was present. She sat very straight. She was wearing a deep burgundy suit. She looked composed in the way that people look composed when composure is the only weapon they have left. The accountant walked through the findings. It took about 40 minutes. The disbursement records. The external account opened in my name. The patterns of transfer over 18 months. The total, and the auditors had now traced it more fully than I'd been able to from the photocopied spreadsheet, was closer to $37,000. Some of it had moved through a second routing that the auditor explained with the patient clarity of someone translating a language, and when she was done, the room was very, very quiet. Pastor Caldwell asked First Lady Caldwell to respond. She said that she had made financial management decisions she believed were in the best interest of the ministry. She said there had been some operational flexibility in how funds were allocated. She said she had intended to document everything properly, and that circumstances had moved faster than her documentation. I noticed she did not say she hadn't done it. Deacon Fraser asked her directly whether she had opened a financial account using Sister Carolyn's personal information. She said she had used available information to establish an administrative account for disbursement processing. He said, using her name, without her knowledge or consent. She did not answer that directly. She said it was a complex situation. The pastor put his hand over his face briefly, just briefly. Then he dropped it and sat up straight and said, in a voice that was very low and very tired and very clear, "Renee, I need you to answer the deacon's question." The silence in that room was extraordinary, the kind of silence that churches rarely allow themselves, the silence where something real is happening and the social performance machinery has finally, completely run out of fuel. She said yes. One word. Pastor Caldwell closed his eyes for a moment. He opened them. He said, "Then we have a serious problem." What followed that meeting was not simple or clean, because real situations almost never are. First Lady Caldwell did not resign immediately. There were conversations, private then with a small group of the most senior deacons, over the following 2 weeks that I was not part of, because they were not mine to be part of. What I know is what Deacon Fraser told me when he called to update me, because he had committed to keeping me informed, and he honored that commitment. The church's insurance carried a fidelity bond that would cover a portion of the loss. The external account had been reported to the State Attorney General's office and to federal banking regulators, given that it involved identity fraud across state-chartered accounts. My attorney, Patricia Holland, coordinated directly with both the church's legal counsel and the fraud investigator at the financial institution. First Lady Caldwell's resignation from all ministerial and administrative roles came at the end of the second week following the Finance Board meeting. Not voluntarily, but in a written agreement negotiated with the church's attorneys as part of a broader settlement process that also included her cooperation with the ongoing financial investigation. Deacon Webb, for his part, was found to have had no direct knowledge of the fraud. His Wednesday phone call had been, as I had suspected, a fishing expedition on First Lady Caldwell's behalf, but one he'd been led into without full information. He stepped down from the Finance Board voluntarily, acknowledging that his judgment had been compromised. He remained a member of the congregation. I did not celebrate that, but I did not contest it either. That was between him and God and the deacon board. The pastor addressed the congregation on a Sunday morning 3 weeks after the Finance Board meeting. He didn't name specifics from the pulpit, a decision I understood, though I had complicated feelings about it. But he acknowledged that the church had experienced a serious breach of financial trust and that appropriate legal and institutional steps were being taken. He asked the congregation's forgiveness for failures of oversight on his part. He announced that the benevolence fund would be restructured under a new 3-person committee with external accounting review. He asked the church to pray for all involved without using names, and then he preached from Micah 7. "Rejoice not against me, O mine enemy. When I fall, I shall arise. When I sit in darkness, the Lord shall be a light unto me." I sat in my pew that morning, and I held on to that scripture the way I'd been holding on to things since Harold died, with both hands, firmly, trusting the weight of it. Brother Jonah was not publicly named, but Deacon Fraser ensured that the deacon board formally thanked him in private and committed to protecting his position at the church. He cried when they told him. He was 26 years old, and he'd carried that information alone for 6 months, and he'd finally found the courage to put it where it needed to go. I told him afterward that Brother Calvin, wherever he was, would be at peace. I believed that. My name was cleared formally in a letter from the church's legal counsel to the financial institution. My credit was intact. My reputation, in the congregation, among the people who mattered, was what it had always been, because it had been built over 17 years, and an envelope full of false records could not undo that foundation. I want to be honest. There were a few people in that congregation who looked at me sideways for a while, who didn't quite know what to make of the whole situation, who maybe wondered about half-remembered rumors. That is the nature of communities. Rumors exist even in sanctified spaces. But the core of that church, the Mother Stokeses and the Deacon Frasers and the Jonah Simmonses, the ordinary faithful people who showed up every Sunday and served and prayed and meant it, they knew, and that was enough. I did not leave Greater Restoration. Some people expected me to. A few friends in ministry suggested that a fresh start might be healing, and I understand that impulse. But I was at that church before any of this happened, and I knew the difference between the institution being misused and the community being destroyed. Greater Restoration was not destroyed. It was wounded and it was being healed, and the healing was slow and sometimes awkward and completely real. I was not going to walk away from a community in the middle of its healing because my own comfort might be served by leaving. That is not the woman my mother raised. I did step back from the hospitality ministry chair for about 6 months, not because I was asked to, but because I needed space to tend to my own interior healing before I could pour into others again. I used that time to sit with Mother Stokes on Saturday mornings, which turned out to be one of the quiet gifts of that whole season. She told me stories about that church going back to its founding that I had never heard. She told me about other storms it had weathered. She said, "Every institution that has ever been built by human hands has been compromised by human hands at some point. That is not the end of the story. That is just the part where you find out what the foundation is actually made of." I came back to the hospitality ministry in the spring. They gave me a welcome back card signed by most of the congregation. Sister Loretta from the kitchen made my favorite sweet potato cake. And I stood at the welcome table on that first Sunday back and handed out bulletins and greeted people coming through the door. And I felt, not triumphant, not self-righteous, not vindicated in any flashy way. I felt clean. The way you feel after you've done something hard and necessary and true and come out the other side with your integrity still your own, that is not nothing. In fact, I think it might be everything. There is something I have been turning over in my spirit ever since, something I want to leave with you before I close. The envelope had my name on it, and for a little while, the enemy of my peace intended that to mean I was trapped, named as guilty, documented as complicit, set up to carry something that was never mine to carry. But there is another way to be named. There is a naming that happens when the truth finds you specifically, in a specific place, at a specific time, because you are the particular person who is positioned to do something about it. I think about Brother Calvin, who documented what he found and trusted it to a young man who didn't know what to do with it. I think about Jonah, who finally placed it where it would be found. I think about Mother Stokes, who had been waiting 8 months for the Lord to move. I think about Deacon Frazier, who had been quietly troubled for 3 years. All of those people, in all of their imperfect timing and human fear, were part of the same motion, a slow, unglamorous, God-directed motion toward the truth. The First Lady went silent when she saw my name because she knew the truth was in that envelope. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the woman whose name was on it had spent 17 years building exactly the kind of life that could withstand the weight of that moment. The truth needed someone to carry it without being crushed by it. And the Lord, who knows what He is doing even when we cannot see it, had been preparing me for that specific weight for a very long time. There is a scripture I've carried with me through all of this from Luke, chapter 8, verse 17. "For nothing is secret that shall not be made manifest, neither anything hid that shall not be known and come abroad, not as a threat, but as a promise, not as condemnation, but as mercy." Because the things that are hidden in our communities, the financial manipulations, the identity misuse, the manufactured records, the quiet silencing of questions, those things do not stay hidden forever. And when they come into the light does not only expose the wrongdoing, it also exposes who was telling the truth all along. The church is not perfect because it is made of people, and people are not perfect. But the gospel at the center of it is. And the gospel says that truth is not merely information. It is a person. It is a force. It is the very nature of the God we serve. And when we align ourselves with truth, even when it is inconvenient, even when it costs us something, even when we are shaking and sleep-deprived and grieving the betrayal of people we trusted, we are on the side of something larger than any single institution or ministry or well-pressed suit. I want to tell you, protect your name. Not defensively, not anxiously, but actively. Know your financial accounts. Know what exists in your name. Know the institutions you serve closely enough to see when something is wrong. Dignity in faith community is not passive. Wisdom is not naive. You can love your church and still require your church to be honest. You can honor leadership and still require leadership to be accountable. Those two things are not in conflict. They are, in fact, the same love expressed in different registers. And if you are ever in a situation like the one I've just described, if you find your name attached to something that isn't yours, if you feel the machinery of institutional image management pressing against you, I want you to remember Carolyn Elaine Watkins Burgess standing at that communion table with an envelope in her hands and a choice in front of her. She did not run. She did not perform. She did not let grief become paralysis or pain become bitterness. She prayed, she thought, she called the people she could trust. She moved carefully and steadily, and with her mother's voice in her ears saying, "Back straight, mouth controlled, discernment sharp." And the truth, which had been waiting to be received, came to the right woman at the right time in the right place. Not by accident, not by luck, by grace. If this story moved something in you, I want to hear about it. Leave a comment below. And if you've ever seen people in a church or any faith community work harder to protect the ministry's image than to protect the truth, tell me about it. You don't have to use names. Just tell me what you saw and what you did. Because your experience matters, and this community that we're building right here is one where we tell the truth about real things together. Like this video if it spoke to something in you. Subscribe to Sister Circle Stories because we are going to keep talking. About faith, about truth, about what it means to stand in the hard places with your dignity intact. Every week, we're here. And we're not going anywhere.